the seriously well-read tag. This tag was created by Randy Ray of the Literate Texan, who has also recently launched his Seriously Well-Read book club. This has been a pretty popular tag, and if the book club turns out to be as popular as the tag, then a lot of people are going to have a lot of fun reading some really good books. Now, without further ado, here are my answers to the tag questions. The first question is, what book made you take reading seriously? To be honest, I think I have always taken reading seriously. I've always loved it. I learned to read really early. According to family lore, it was self-taught. I just have always gravitated to books and considered reading very worthwhile. But what I thought of when I read this question was the book From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by E.L. Konigsberg, which was kind of a gateway book in my reading history. Before this, I had read a lot of juvenile series, Nancy Drews, Bobbsey Twins, Hardy Boys, Choose Your Own Adventure, Sweet Valley, Kids, Twins, and High. Pretty much anything you would toss at a kid who devoured books. But it was when I read From the Mixed Up Files that my world kind of exploded. I had no idea that books could be like this. And from this moment on, I became pretty serious about choosing my books. And this actually is the copy that I got at maybe 11 or 12. So you can see it's pretty old. And I love it. So this is the book that, if it did not make me take reading seriously, it made me take intentional reading and the choosing of books very seriously. Question number 2. Which book did you pretend to understand? Be honest. I find it so funny that this is the only question which has "be honest" tacked on it. I wasn't planning to be deceptive. Okay, so the book I pretended to understand was The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And what happened was that a lifetime ago, when I had my first job, which was teaching high school English, this was on the syllabus. I was a brand new teacher. This is not the book I would have picked, but it was already on the syllabus. I had to teach it. So I asked, the subject area head, what exactly am I supposed to do? What approach would you recommend? And she said, oh, this will be fantastic because the students will really relate to Holden. Holden is very anti-phoniness, and teenagers are like that. And Holden is often disappointed by people, and teenagers are often disappointed by people. I said, okay. So I drew up some lesson plans which presupposed that the majority of the students would absolutely relate to Holden and identify with everything he was going through. And guess what? They did not. They did not like him. That was a really uncomfortable 3 weeks. And if any of my former students are watching this, I'm sorry, guys. Question 3. Which 3 books are on your personal required reading list? Despite my background in teaching, or maybe because of it, I am not a huge fan of required reading. I am, on the other hand, a big believer in a canon, in texts that are fundamental to a culture and that one needs to be familiar with in order to be well read. And one of those books is the Bible. And I think this is an important book to be familiar with, whether or not you are a believer, whether or not you are religious. When I was majoring in English literature, there was one course called The Novel, in which we read Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, E.M. Forster, Joseph Conrad, and D.H. Lawrence. So that was a pretty wide selection, from the Regency and Victorian writers to the modernists. And the professor was always highlighting passages in the text which he said were quotations or paraphrases or allusions to something in the Bible, specifically the King James Bible, because these were English authors. And I remember thinking at the time, well, duh, isn't it obvious? Why are you pointing it out? And I was surprised when several of my classmates didn't know that. And these writers were not all believers either. But because the King James translation of the Bible had saturated the English language for centuries, and I really think that someone who wants to read English literature seriously and appreciate as many layers of it as possible should be familiar with the Bible. By the way, I'm not saying that if you're not familiar with the Bible, you're not well read. I'm sorry for that double negative. It's just that it helps. It really helps. And it unlocks, as I said, a layer of meaning that you otherwise would not have access to. So I do recommend it. And the second book I would make required reading for anyone who wants to be well read is Greek mythology. Probably second to the Bible are the allusions to the Greek myths. This textbook focuses only on the myths of Orpheus and Eurydice, Venus and Adonis, and Pygmalion and Galatea, though just Pygmalion, because I think Galatea was a name that was given to the statue much later. But look at how thick it is. And these are just 3 myths. I would say probably not even the best known myths. So imagine how many more allusions to the better known myths there are. My lecturer compared the figures in Greek mythology to Disney characters. If you've ever done a "What Disney princess are you?" quiz, or watched a TikTok or put together a mood board on the aesthetics of one of the Disney princesses or any of the Disney characters, then you're kind of doing with these Disney characters what a lot of writers in English literature were doing with the gods and goddesses and heroes of Greek mythology. And that's why I recommend familiarity with the Greek myths. And finally, I could not think of a third text which was fundamental in the same way, so I decided to go with what I would require if I were still teaching, and that would be the Divine Comedy by Dante. And if you could get Anthony Esselin's translations, and I highly recommend those. And the reason I recommend the Divine Comedy is that it is pretty much an outline of the universe, an outline of life. You may not agree with how Dante outlines everything, but this is a great example of the medieval mind and just a mind in general. A mind that has considered everything, found a place for everything, figured out that there's a path. It's not that he lays out an argument, but he just represents the universe in microcosm. And I think that if we let him show us how he did it, it would help us do the same thing. Because of course, everyone has their own understanding of the universe, how they would arrange things and group things, what metaphors they would use. And once you've seen a master at work, you can start doing your own thing. Not necessarily an imitation of him, but it never hurts to stand on the shoulders of someone who could see so far and so comprehensively. Question number 4. What author have you been avoiding? Psych! It's not J.K. Rowling. Obviously, I have this book. I have the others too. But it's someone who kind of has a similar impact. And I'm referring to George R.R. Martin. Stay with me here. When Harry Potter was at the height of its popularity, even people who did not read the books or watch the movies knew about it. They knew specific things about it that if it had been any other book or any other movie franchise, they wouldn't really know. It had permeated the culture so much. I found that interesting as someone who was, you know, inside the circle of Potter initiates. And I was always curious about what it would be like to be on the outside. And when George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series started to become really, really popular, I realized that was my chance. That was my chance to be on the outside and to see how well a series that I did not read and did not watch could still penetrate my consciousness and maybe even my language and just in general my knowledge. So I made a deliberate decision never to read or even to watch Game of Thrones. And it paid off in a really fun way when the Hodor episode aired, because the people in my family who watched Game of Thrones really, really liked that one. And we're discussing it at the dinner table. So I figured out who Hodor was and what his backstory was. And at that time, I was working in a company where we used software that responded to voice commands. And for fun, you could train your software to respond to nonsense words or funny phrases. And someone at work gave his software the command Hodor. And I thought, oh, I know what that means. It's certainly not a way to read a book, but it's a way to appreciate a book, I guess. Question 5. What is the hardest book you've ever read? I swear this is true. This is 100% true. Twilight is the hardest book I have ever read. I think I could make an entire video about how frustrating this was to read, but I'll focus on one thing. There's a famous line in this, which all Twilight readers know and which I prepared before this video. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was part of him, and I didn't know how potent that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. So this paragraph comes a little under halfway into the novel, and I remember that when I was reading this for the first time, I stopped short at that line because it surprised me. I didn't think that she had already fallen in love with him. And I thought, okay, I wasn't reading it properly. I should go back. So I flipped back a few chapters, read again, was into the story again, and then I got to that line again, unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. And I thought, wait, when did that happen? I missed it again. So I flipped back even more chapters so that I'd be sure not to miss the part where she falls in love, kept reading, hit this line again. Eventually, I told myself, just accept it happened, suspend your disbelief and keep going, because otherwise I would have been in an endless loop of when did she actually fall in love? I don't get it. So I kept reading, I finished the book. Okay. Now, a few years later, a friend of mine said she was going to read Twilight for the first time, and I thought, okay, cool, a buddy read. I actually wasn't planning on rereading Twilight itself. I had read Twilight and New Moon. I had hated New Moon. So I decided to join her at Eclipse and Breaking Dawn. And I strangely enough really enjoyed Eclipse. and also enjoyed Breaking Dawn. And I thought, okay, I'll be fair to the Twilight books. I will reread the first novel. I happen to still have my copy. I started reading. I got to that paragraph, completely or unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. And the same question, what? When? And by this time, I had read the whole series. I had taken for granted they were in love. I didn't understand why she was already in love with him at this point. Okay, that's all I have to say. This was really hard. Question number 6. What is a book that changed how you read? I don't think any book on its own changed how I read, unless you count From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. But I can think of several people who have changed how I read because of what they saw in their reading. A high school classmate who influenced the way I would read from then on because of her deeper appreciation of Stephen King. No, it was not Pet Sematary. It was Carrie, but I don't have my old copy of Carrie any longer. And this might have been really obvious to other readers, but it was not to me. When she saw me reading Carrie, she said, "Oh, isn't it interesting how symbolic blood is?" I said, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, whenever blood shows up in the story, it means something. It's pointing to something." And if you're familiar with the Carrie story, you might say, well, obviously. But at that time, I had thought symbolism and this kind of deep reading could only be done with classics and serious literature, and Stephen King was mass market king. But because of what she said, it deepened my appreciation of Stephen King's writing. It deepened my appreciation of popular literature. It definitely changed the way I read even the serious stuff. So, hey, thanks for that. Question number 7, quantity versus quality. Would you rather read 100 good books in a year or 10 great books? And this is the first of the questions that has the answer that it does because I am on BookTube. If I weren't on BookTube, I think I would go for the 10 great books, a great books course. Maybe we'd read the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Divine Comedy, mammoths like East of Eden, Moby Dick. But because I am on BookTube, I would go for the 100 good books. And it's not just because I need stuff for content, but it's because this project is primarily for me. It's a way to document my reading while sharing it at the same time. I do single book reviews using a 5P system, and I also have a spreadsheet in which I keep track of all my ratings and in which I color code the books depending on the reading challenge or reading project I read them for. There's a lot of other data in there. And at the end of the year, I'm going to have some real stats. And for stats to be interesting, I'm going to need a lot of books. And one of those books, which is an example of a good book that is not also a great book, is Onion John by Joseph Crumgold, which is the read that I finished just today. As I said, it's good. It's not great. I'm going to have a 5P review on it in which I go into detail. I would not have read it and thought deeply about it if I were in a reading year of only 10 great books. So each choice, I think, has its benefits and its rewards, and of course, its trade-offs. And I'm pretty happy with the choice of quantity. Question 8. What genre are you embarrassed to say you have not read? I have read widely enough that this was a really difficult question to answer. And then the word embarrassed is there, which adds an extra level of challenge. One genre I really have not read is splatterpunk. Am I embarrassed that I have not read splatterpunk? No. But I am kind of embarrassed that I have not read this genre. And at first, I wasn't going to hold up a book for it because why would I have a book if I haven't read the genre? But here's a book that kind of exemplifies what I mean. The Roman Way by Edith Hamilton. It's because the genre I'm embarrassed to have not read yet is ancient Greek comedy. I've read ancient Greek tragedy, Oedipus the King. The comedies, no, I managed to completely miss Aristophanes. So I kind of feel like an ancient Roman who was really happy with the ancient Roman drama and didn't really want ancient Greek drama and is now less well-read because of it. Question number 9. Which book do you think most people misread? Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Guys, Heathcliff and Cathy are siblings. That's all I'm going to say about that. And finally, question 10. What does seriously well-read mean to you? My answer to this question is the reason it took me so long to do this tag. Well, apart from the fact that nobody tagged me. And the reason is that I have been thinking about this on my own, even before Randy Ray created this tag, and I was considering making a standalone video. But I have been dithering and dithering on making that video, and I figured that since this tag is really popular, I would probably get more discussion on these ideas by doing the tag than by releasing an independent video. So I have been thinking about what it means to be well-read since I was on Book Talk last year, when a creator named Princess Weeks defined it as being familiar with books that are canonical or books that are canonical in your preferred genre. So if your preferred genre is science fiction, then you should know the so-called big three of Clarke, Asimov, and Heinlein. You should be familiar with Bradbury, Ursula Le Guin, the minor writers who have still contributed classics to the genre. And this is your foundation for being well-read. And what I liked about what she said was not that she was imposing a canon on people, saying you have to read this or else, but she was saying that being well-read goes beyond just following your personal taste. You should be able to appreciate a text's value beyond the entertainment it can give you. It might not even be entertaining or very fun to read while you're reading it, but it's something that has been foundational or canonical or influential, and it's worth knowing. So being well-read is about being bigger than just your individual self as a reader. Another book talker who contributed to this was Petrus. For him, being well-read meant being a more comprehensive reader. So not just reading within one genre or one time period or one geographical area, but reading as widely as possible. And also being able to put works of literature in context, being objective about them. I don't remember if this is something he said or if it's something that I came up with as a paraphrase, but what is meant by being able to comment objectively on works is that you could say why a text is valuable, you can put it in context in history or in its genre without interjecting your personal opinion at all. Now, I'm a very opinionated person, but this seemed like a really worthwhile thing to aim for. Someone else who contributed to the idea I have of being well-read is Randy Ray himself, who said that there must be a deepening or a building of something. It's not just about finishing really, really good books in isolation, because books talk to each other. Well, That's how I put it. Books are in conversation. I believe his metaphor was building. Books build on each other, and at the end of a reading project or at the end of a year of being a member of his Seriously Well-Read book club, you should feel as if you have built a really good foundation from which you can approach so many other various works of literature. And when he talked about the deepening of the soul, he also used the word transformation. Books have to transform you a little bit. If you read a really, really great work of literature and are basically the same person at the end of it as you are at the beginning, that isn't really a good sign. A reading experience should change something about you, especially if it is a good book. It should change the way you think about something, the way you see something, the way you feel about something. It might even change something that is so deep inside of you that you might not realize that it has changed you. And the last person to help me out with my thinking of what it means to be well-read is Carl of Please Read Your Book, who just articulated in another way what Randy was saying when he said being well-read means being able to engage and think about books very genuinely. Again, not just reading to finish the book. It's not just about getting from point A to point B. It's about meeting the book in conversation, as it were, and letting the ideas in that book play off your own ideas. And this kind of goes back to why I think The Divine Comedy is a really good book to require us all to read, because we all have a concept of the universe in our minds. We just have not maybe articulated it to ourselves. And if we don't have a clear picture of how we think or how we see things, how can we really engage with others who have thought about how they see things? This video is a lot longer than I thought it would be when I drafted my script. I'm certainly a lot sweatier than I was when I first started. This has been a really great conversation. I have loved hearing other people's answers to the questions. This is a really big ask, but if Randy or if someone could do a video compiling all the greatest hits, the greatest answers, the funniest answers, the most thought-provoking answers, maybe answers that rub some people the wrong way, I think it would be the most epic thing that we have had on BookTube. But I don't think anyone's going to do it, so just look up the Seriously Well-Read tag and watch the videos as I have. This is probably my favorite tag to have participated in and my favorite tag to have heard other people's answers to since I got here, which isn't saying much. I've only been here since January. But it's gonna be hard to beat, even if I'm here for another few years. Since I was not tagged in this, I'm not going to tag others, but I do want to give a shout out to 3 people whom I think are seriously well-read, each in his or her own way. So the first is Heather of Heather Reads, and next is Joseph Francis Burton, and last is someone I just discovered last week, Rashmika of Rashmika Likes Books. They all have great taste in books and interesting things to say about the books they've read. And I hope that you thought I had some interesting things to say about the books I read too. And if you'd like to respond to any of the points I've made, I would really love to read your comments.